Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for showing up for a talk on page objects. First thing everyone hears is like, oh, not another talk about page objects. Well, hopefully we'll be telling you something interesting. I definitely have had disagreements and arguments in the last week about a number of these topics, so expect to think about the things I'm saying. All right. As far as my bio goes, thank you very much for the introduction. What matters as part of my background is that I have written 5 different frameworks at different companies. I've actually screwed up page objects 5 times. And I'm also, as part of a solution architect at Sauce Labs, I get to see a bunch of clients' code and take a look at their frameworks, do framework assessments, do code reviews. And the reason I'm giving a talk on page objects is because pretty much all of them, or the vast majority of them, are doing things that I see are not ideal. And so we're going to talk about some of the things I've seen and what my suggestions are as a result. All right, so a few ground rules. First of all, obviously my opinions are correct. I have a lot of opinions. But the point of this is to help you make informed decisions about what you're doing. I'm not here to say you have to change everything you're doing currently. I'm here to give you ideas about what you can do if you're working on things in the future. So to start with, this idea of I have a hammer, so everything must be a nail. You can make anything work. I've seen very complicated setups. I've seen engineers be super excited about everything they've put together, this really complex system with all of this abstraction, all of these layers. And they're like, no, it's dialed in exactly to what I want. Yes, but how long does it take for someone to come in and pick that framework up and understand what's going on? If I'm coming into a company to do a framework assessment, if it's going to take me an hour and a half just to figure out what's going on, what abstraction is coming from where, what's it actually doing, where's the data stored, I've seen a lot of these frameworks, and if I'm struggling with it, how are your beginner test automation engineers going to be able to get up to speed quickly? And maybe more importantly for the company, when you leave the company, what's going to happen? I have seen, it's a very common pattern for when the engineer who writes a framework, when they leave the company scraps the framework and goes to something else. Because the people that are left are like, we don't really know what's going on with that, like we can use it, but if there's any problems, we don't know where to make the changes. And so they just move to something else. And again, a lot of people get tied into one way of doing things. That's all they know, and they make it work for them. Think about alternative ways to do it. So I realize that a lot of the times that I get into disagreements with people about page objects, it has more to do with our fundamental assumptions and the things we're trying to optimize. Because I have too many opinions, I do not have time to get into the why of these, but I'm going to walk through a couple of them. The first thing is, I don't like the term end-to-end tests. It means something different to testers than it does to developers. Developers hear end-to-end and they think the entire system, the full stack. Testers think of end-to-end and they're almost always talking about the user flow or the journey through the site. It's an overloaded term, and it's really difficult. You have to understand the context in which it's being given. So when I'm talking about end-to-end, I mean DOM to database, which is the full validation that the thing that you care about is working from what goes into the browser, through the API, through the service layer, to the database, and back. In my opinion, scalable test automation requires tests to be atomic, autonomous, and short. That means they're focused on one particular thing. You're not doing a long journey through a site. You're doing a bunch of small, focused tests that are exercising the full DOM to database evaluation of a feature. They're autonomous, which means they can be run by themselves in any order and at the same time as anything else without causing a problem. A big one for me, what are we trying to optimize here? Maintenance costs are more expensive than the combination of creation costs and execution costs. Pretty much everything you should be doing when you're working with a framework or page objects or anything is trying to figure out what is going to make it easier for me to maintain this code going forward. And a lot of times we get caught up in this idea of, oh, I heard Uncle Bob say this, or oh, someone else has this great post online that's talking about all of the ways that it should be solid. I care more about, are you going to be able to keep up with changes to your site? And when something breaks, are you going to be able to easily understand what's going on? Always prefer simple and clear to easy and fast. So, basic definition, object-oriented class stores information about the services provided by a specific view in an application's user interface. This can be a browser, a mobile application, it can be a desktop browser, it can be the browser on your mobile app. It doesn't have to be a page, it can be a modal, it can be a section. Typically, it's comprised of action methods and element definitions. All right, so what problems are we trying to solve with page objects? Maintenance costs. We're trying to reduce maintenance costs with our page objects. Provide a separation of concerns to make it easier to keep track of where things are. Dry, don't repeat yourself. A place for everything and everything in its place. It's a quote from the late 18th century, so obviously it was by Benjamin Franklin because everything interesting said in the late 18th century was said by him. So a couple of conventions for maintainability. There are many of these. The two that I'm going to highlight are the idea of consistency and the principle of least surprise. I have a Ruby background. One of the main tenets of Ruby is that the methods that you're using and the names of things that you're doing, you shouldn't be surprised by what result you get from them. So a couple critiques of page objects that are common. First one is page object abstract too much. This idea of YAGNI. How many people know what YAGNI stands for? Everyone in my workshop knows. You ain't gonna need it. Don't over abstract, don't implement things before you know that you're going to need them. Keep things simple first, and then see what things. And as you become a more advanced SDET, test automation engineer, you're gonna see what patterns repeat themselves and what kinds of things you're going to want to focus on, but be very careful before you start moving on. So that's a great principle. The idea is to keep the code base smaller by not over abstracting. The problem is you're gonna have inconsistency with this, and maintenance down the road can be much more difficult. And so the other critique is we need to abstract more. Single responsibility principle is not being followed. We need to keep classes smaller by doing more abstraction, which again, is not following YAGNI. It is making things more complex right away. Both of these things are gonna be addressed by my first principle here. So here are the 6 that I whittled down from like the 15 or 16 that I came up with that I wanted to talk about. First one is to be declarative, not imperative. If anyone saw Angie Jones' talk earlier, this is essentially what she did. She made a declarative test out of an imperative flow. Essentially, declarative is sticking to the overall business logic, the big picture understanding of what is happening as opposed to getting into the implementation details and the step-by-step. So here's an example. Notice we're referencing the driver here, noticing that the returns from our page objects are Selenium elements in this case, and the methods that we're acting on are from the Selenium API. We're specifying the specific data that we're using for all of these. I see oftentimes there are a number of articles out there talking about why page objects are bad, and almost always it's because they say page objects do this, which isn't the case. It's kind of a straw man. We should be doing something more like this. This is kind of a given when then or an arrange act assert. We are going to visit a sign-in page. We're going to sign in with a valid user information, and then we are going to expect to be signed in. That's the business logic. Anyone can read this and understand what this test is going to do. And all of the implementation details are in the page object. Things that encourage imperative testing, this idea of keyword-driven, like so many people love the robot framework, but it's designed to click on things and identify things in the test itself. Data-driven, a lot of BDD. I'm not sure anyone who's seen like the scenario outlines that have just like these huge tables of data. And so you're saying, put this data in these places, and then it's gonna create this output. A number of test libraries have special matchers that look for specific attribute values from specific elements, which require you to specify Selenium API things in your test methods. And then property files, this is one of the things we see when people are saying that we are abstracting too much. Let's just store all of the locators in a property file, which is a great idea. Why are you creating a completely separate class just to return element IDs or elements from element IDs? That's true, but you should be abstracting other things as well to make this work. All right, so the second is to be deterministic, not non-deterministic. This means that your test should be repeatable. It should be a given test should be taking the same path through your site every single time. I have seen people promote this kind of code. We're like, hey, we are writing our tests in a declarative fashion, and because we're doing that, that means the same test applies to a mobile app as it does to a mobile browser as it does to a desktop browser. So why don't we just reuse the page object, the same page object, and we'll just throw in a conditional, and if we see one element, we'll take one path, and if we don't see it, we'll take another path. The problem with this is it becomes non-deterministic, because what happens if the mobile element just isn't there when we make that first call? Now we're down the wrong path, we're doing the wrong things, we're gonna have a failure even though the system is working as intended. So we're gonna have synchronization issues as a result of this. And your test already knows what it's supposed to do. You can check the driver. Are we an Appium driver? Are we a Selenium driver? What configuration determined what driver we were gonna start up in the first place? We should be thinking of conditionals as bugs, essentially. I have seen page objects thousands of lines long that are essentially nested conditional. You can't understand anything that's going on there without an IDE that allows you to dial into things specifically. It's very difficult to maintain. So what do we do instead of conditionals? In Ruby, we can metaprogram and just dynamically create exactly what we want whenever we want. Most of you don't have that option. Many different ways to do this. An example of something that could be done instead is just to require the page objects that you want with the conditional in the setup at the beginning. And then you don't have conditionals all the way through your code. You're just referencing, for instance, the home page every time you need a home page, and it's the right one because you required those files. So use simple constructors, not magic constructors. Pretty much anytime something can be described as magic, it's probably bad. And this comes down to the simplicity versus the easy. You want to be able to recognize what's going on quickly rather than making something that abstracts things out in such a way that it's really easy to write, but it hides what's actually happening. You end up making people have to work around what you've done unless they already understand the implementation, and at that point, what was the purpose of the abstraction in the first place? So what do I mean by this? So I have seen this pattern where people use the constructor to set the state for the page object. I've done this before. Thought it was a great idea. Initialize the driver, or we've got the driver, we're going to navigate to something, we're gonna find an element, and then we're gonna wait for the result. So as soon as we've initialized this method, we know we're at the right place to take additional actions. We can tidy it up a little bit. This is a good idea because the user should not care about how they get to the page. They just need to be there in order to take the action. And this is the idea of an atomic test. You're setting state in some fashion, and then you're taking an evaluation of one particular piece of functionality. So what's the user going to do? The user's going to initialize this driver, store it in a variable, do something else, and then try and use the same page object from that variable. A lot of what we're doing when we're talking about these things is trying to think ahead to how your users are going to misuse what you've done, because they will. And so if we try to make the conventions useful, and if we try and do things that are expected, it's going to be easier. I consider this magic because when you initialize something, what does it make sense by just saying new class that it's going to return, that it's going to do all of those things? Not necessarily. You could do it one time, you might not do it the next. Now you have inconsistent behavior. You'll have users that will create a new page object and not remember to do these things. I prefer to implement something like a visit method that's explicit. So now, whenever we're using this, we initialize it, and we make a visit action, and the page object is going to know how to get to where it should live. So in this case, we are navigating, we're finding the element, and then we're returning the page object. We could also reuse other page objects, and this is a little bit better as far as implementation details, because if the previous steps change, we can reference other things. Oftentimes, though, we can just be direct. Again, if we're using the visit method, we're saying we don't care how we get here, we just need to be here. We need the state set so that we can take the actions we need to take. And this pattern can be repeated in much more complex ways in other places. Sometimes you have to click a modal button, so you can't be as precise, but other times you can set things up using an API or other means. All right, so this is the contentious one that people like to disagree with me over, and I think a lot of it has to do with my priors, but we'll talk about it. So I just got done saying that it's okay in your visit method to reference other page objects in order to get there. Because again, I don't really care how that's implemented, but if it's already there in another page object, I'm fine with that. So what do I mean by coupled? In the page object as described on the Selenium page itself, in the Selenium documentation, it says that each method on a page object should return an instance of another page object, which is essentially creating a web of all of your page objects that have to know about each other in every single service or action that you're taking. So it would look like this. We're going to initialize a home page, and then we're going to click a follow, sign in, and that's going to return an instance of a sign-in page. We do something else that's going to return a sign-up page. Oftentimes, your users will end up doing fun things like this, which isn't the easiest to read. It isn't the easiest to see what's going on. I mean, you can put this on different lines, but again, it's this kind of what exactly is going on, I'm not sure. Do we need to know this information? If we need to know this information, why are we putting it in this format? So my first objection, the main objection, not the main objection. My first objection is I don't care for the Fluent pattern in the first place. This is a big thing in Java especially. For static type languages, errors in a Fluent pattern are not found at compile time, they're found at execution time. You often will see issues with debuggers or stack traces not giving you the information that you need to make the decisions you need to make quickly. And I've seen people make all sorts of crazy method names just to make a fun English sentence out of their Fluent pattern, which, again, makes it difficult when you're using it in any other context. And the other implementation detail is if you're doing subclassing, which we often end up doing with our page objects, you have to explicitly define everything in the Fluent pattern in the subclass. All right, so page object-specific objections. First one is code repeatability. So when I implemented this the right way and did all of every page object returning this as another page object, I ran into the problem of we had a login modal. That login modal had the exact same locators, the exact same service, but sometimes it was called from the check-in page and returned you to the check-in page, and sometimes it returned you to the home page from the login page. And so what was I supposed to do? Create a cart login page and a login page? Am I supposed to put different methods in to get called on the same login class that are going to return different things? Or are we just going to intermittently, we're just not going to return a page object for that? Then we come back to the principle of consistency. If sometimes we're returning an instance of a page object and other times we're not, how are we going to easily understand what it is that we should be doing? Your test already knows the pattern. If it's important to specify the flow for some reason, your test already knows about it. So why are we storing the same information in multiple places? Is the return value obvious? Again, principle of least surprise. Are we getting what we expect? How do you know for some of these methods exactly what it's going to return? You now have to have contextual knowledge of the implementation of the system when looking at your test to understand what you should be doing. If the visit method is providing the state that you need, and we want to run an atomic test, theoretically you only need one page object. You set the state, you take the action, you do the validation. The biggest reason, though, there's no good reason to couple them unnecessarily. It is not that much more difficult to just see this is what we are initializing next. You could tidy up the first one there to remove the variable names. But again, it's very obvious with the second one what's going on. It's not that much more to write, and it keeps you from having to maintain a graph of how all of your page objects interact. The purpose of the page object is to allow you to maintain what you're doing, make changes as the application changes. It should not be necessary to do this. All right, so another contentious one is whether we should be raising exceptions in our page objects or making assertions in the page objects. So I see a lot of people will inherit their matcher libraries into page objects and then make one or many assertions throughout the test. The distinction between an assertion and an exception is whether you have evaluated the functionality that you care about and have determined whether or not it is working. If you can't do that, then you should throw an exception that says, I'm unable to even evaluate it in the first place. And most IDEs, most CI tools will make a distinction between if it is an exception or an assertion failure. And so it's very easy to see, oh yes, the problem is what I was testing, versus, oh hey, I have to figure out why I couldn't test this in the first place. Is there another test whose assertion failed that my accepted test is failing as a result of? All right, and the final one I'm going to talk about is considering method intent. This is a slightly controversial one as well. This is a common test pattern, signing in. So what happens if our sign in form fails for some reason? What's the error message we're going to see when we're going to get current user and make sure it matches the information we passed in to the page object? We're going to see something like this, element not found. What does that tell us about what happened with the test? Nothing. We've got the wrong stack trace. We've got an exception that gives us no useful information to what went wrong. Not finding the element is not actually the problem that we're trying to address. Often it's if you're doing steps or some kind of setting state and then taking action, the problem happened on a previous step, so the entire stack trace is completely unusable. So what if we were to include the expectation in the method itself? There's many different ways you can do this. You can have parameters that you're passing in. This can do a number of different things. In this case, we're keeping it dry by having a sign-in. And theoretically, we would have a sign-in unsuccessfully method or the like. We're doing the same sign-in, but then we're able to set some kind of expectation at the end so that if that expectation is not met, we know exactly what went wrong. And we could even have a method for, let's get all of the elements on the page. Maybe your errors all have an error class. Like, let's find all of the locators on the page that are error classes and print out their results. The other useful thing with this is, again, allowing it to be more deterministic. Non-deterministic is you are able to synchronize your test with where the browser is at. So if you're waiting for something specifically, you're not going to end up on another page. You're not going to be trying to do something on a page that hasn't loaded yet because you have synchronized your code with the state of the site. All right. So I have a list of additional anti-patterns that didn't make the cut for this talk. I'm not going to walk through all of these. I see a lot of people overloading the base page, doing a lot of unnecessary things. Anything like the kitchen sink, as I call it, is in the base page. Oftentimes you can create additional objects that use the methods that you need and reference those objects instead of just calling a method in the namespace that you're in a global namespace and overpopulating it. All right. So I would like for you to tweet at me with a bad page object, if you would like, your bad page object experiences, anything that you disagreed with in this talk, or anything that you want to comment on, or your experiences, things that I didn't talk about that you get frustrated by. Pretty much everything in here I have actually done or seen more frequently. Probably the biggest one is the imperative versus the declarative. People are just mixing in their implementation logic inside their code rather than putting it in the page object where when a change to the site is made, it is easy to make those adjustments. Does anyone have any questions about any of these? Got some.
You went really fast over the exceptions over assertions part. So were you saying you only want to raise an assertion when it's really clear what the failure was and you want an exception to know that, or could you kind of clarify what you meant by that?
Right. So I only want one assertion. It belongs in the test. The test is opinionated. Your page object just represents state. It does not represent opinions.
The page object itself does not raise, yeah, right.
The page object does not raise exceptions. The page object will raise an exception, sorry, it won't make any assertions, it will raise an exception. So your page objects have the exceptions, your tests methods themselves will have the assertions.
Oh, perfect, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, is there any tools that can check this page object patterns?
Well, I have written a page object gem called water drops that relies on water specifically, but it tries to do a lot of these things by making it clear what's happening and minimizing some of these things. It's not in a perfectly polished state, but there's a lot of things like on page and for automatic form filling and things like that that make it easy to be explicit about what's happening and be explicit about what's expected as a result of what's happening. Something like what? Like Rubocop. Oh, no, I don't have a linter or anything like that for these. I think it would be really difficult to do that. You can ask Dave Hefner about that more later.
When you talked about coupling versus decoupling,
yeah.
In your opinion, is it worth it to go back through tests that have already been written using coupling and changing it to be decoupled?
In general, I do not recommend changing what you're doing unless you see a positive value to not doing that anymore or to making that change. It's all opportunity cost. Is your time better spent changing things in the future? But if you're returning those values, there's nothing that says you have to use them, is another thing. So as you're making new ones or as you're moving forward, there is value to consistency regardless, because you want people to be able to just write the test and have it be obvious what it's going to be doing at each step.
In one slide, you told that you don't encourage to use soft assertions. So in our case, for example, I have some kind of unit test for a page. I go to a page and verify a couple of dozens of objects. Some are available, some are visible, right. So far. If I don't use soft assertions, I need to create a couple of dozens of tests instead.
Right.
So
when people ask me this question, the first thing I typically ask is, what % failures do you have in your test suite? If you're down to 0% failures, that's a good time to start writing a whole bunch of content checks in your code. At the point that you have a lot of failures, you should be focused on the functionality of the site and making sure that the state of the actions that users are going to take on the site work. That's the first and most important top priority. Things like checking your navigation, things like checking content, often that actually does belong in a real unit test in the development code for a lot of those things. There's a lot of stuff that can be handled at a lower level and not have to open a browser in order to do that. Browsers are hard. Browsers are difficult to deal with. Try and do the things that you need to do in a browser and make sure you're prioritizing the things. So that's one of the reasons why I don't do soft assertions is I usually don't do those tests in the first place.
What's your take on wrapping web elements with some like wrapper and like overriding the core methods like click, like to deal with synchronization, or maybe creating a proxy of the web element?
So when I'm talking about wrapping objects, I'm talking about, like, for instance, in Water, the test library that I use, it's based on Selenium. We implement an element class that's subclass with all the different types of elements that we're pulling from the HTML5 specification automatically, generating all of these things. We're able to subclass and encapsulate all of the behavior specific to a text field versus an input button versus a link element. And the idea is, instead of just putting all of those clicks and send keys and things like that in your base page, move all of that out and reference an element outside of that. It adds a whole bunch of other value in addition to just not overpopulating your base page, but that's one. We'll see a lot of alert handling, a lot of cookie handling, there's just a lot of things that people just throw a whole bunch of methods in the base page because, if anything in any page object needs it, let's put it up there. Where if you're referencing objects outside of the base page, it's easier to maintain a more robust and lightweight base page.
Thanks, Titus. All right, well, you guys heard him. You can find him on Twitter. Tweet him at Titus Fortner, and he wants to see all your page objects. Where'd you go? I stand between you and craft beer, which is being hosted in the expo hall from 3:05 to 3:55. And I really urge you to join us for the fourth keynote this afternoon that starts at 4 in the main ballroom, where Thomas Boyles will be chatting with you about scaling sauce. Thanks so much for joining me in this room, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.